Good morning, friends. Good holiday weekend. To me, it's kind of Memorial Day and Mother's Day because we're talking about Sarah and all the preps, talking about the weight that it took for her to remember, for us to remember the weight that she went through in having Isaac. So, as we talk about Sarah, I've got kind of a mix of feelings. I'm really excited to share the really neat things that God did in Sarah's life, and the way that God has always had a special place for women, even in societies that didn't give them much attention or accord or credit. But the Bible shows us plenty of cases where God has made sure that we know that He values and cares for women. And we're working on pictures of extraordinary women in the Bible all through the summer. So that's the excited part of this, to share that goodness. The kind of humility is the fact that here I am going to talk about the challenges and the trials and tribulations of this woman who was waiting to have kids, and I'm a 36-year-old guy, right? So what can I speak to that? Although I suppose being 36 and single give me some kind of insight into that. I don't claim to match the pain. I really probably should have taken my phone number down from the church directory before saying I was 36 and single. So, positive note, we have a directory. Whew. We're going to talk about Sarah, and sometimes we say Sarai and Sarah. It's the different names that she has there. I may flip-flop there, but it's for the same person. And I'll tell you that as we look at Sarah, I had sort of an initial perception of her as kind of stuck up, maybe a little kind of shrewish, maybe a bit of a princess, and her name actually means my princess. And you may do what I did, and that is kind of remember her for the mistakes she made or kind of the poor decisions she made. But let me start with Sarah's introduction in Genesis. It says, "Now Sarah was childless because she was not able to conceive." So that's our first slice of seeing that. And you know that this tortured her because every event of conflict or challenge or poor decision in her life revolved around that desire and the fact that she couldn't conceive. So that kind of reinforces what I had first thought, but let me give you what the final accounting is in Hebrews 11:11, where we see the hall of faith of heroes that God has there. "And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who made the promise." So don't forget that God counts her faithful, despite the fact that she is, like us, a person who had difficulties and was flawed, but followed God as she went through that. So what we're going to do is we're going to break Sarah's life through Genesis, which covers a fair amount. It goes from Genesis 12 to Genesis 21. So we're kind of break it down into 3 chapters. The first chapter is going to be the calling. Chapter 2 is going to be waiting and consequences. And chapter 3 will be fulfillment. So we start with chapter 1, the big changes, the calling that God has for Abram and Sarah in Genesis 12. "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you.' So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there." So Abram's 75 at this point, and Sarah is 65. And these are big, life-changing decisions. We tend to think about Abram and Sarai as wanderers, that we know that they spend a lot of their life wandering because God called them to that. But this is the point when they're 65 and 75. They've been city folk up till then. This is a complete change of the way they lived and what their life was based on. And it's moving, especially if you're going to live in a different place, is such a big deal. It seems like everyone knows. When your neighbors have that U-Haul truck out front, you know that, right? So my family, we grew up in Rhode Island, and we had cats, and my grandparents lived in Pennsylvania. And so as kids, we'd go and visit them every, summer and winter. And so the one thing the cats were not allowed on was the table. That was Mom's special spot. Never, ever, ever, ever any cats on there. And they knew it, and it was enforced. So we're packing up, we're going for a summer trip, and we get in the car, and we go out the door. And we're probably about 3 blocks down the road when we realize we've forgotten something, probably a pillow. And so we decide we're close enough, we're going to turn back. We get to the house, we pop out, putting the key in the lock, and we look in that front window, and there is Charlie, spread-eagled on the table. Like, I know you're going to be gone for a week. He sees Mom sees him, he goes, pew! Even the pets know when you're traveling, okay? And that was for a week. So here we have this life change, the first example of what the call really was for Abram and Sarah, a change of life and who they were. And this call is not just kind of a, let's just do this thing. God has a promise here and a purpose. This is part of the plan that God has that we saw last week when we looked at Eve and the sin that happened in the garden with Adam and Eve, and God's long plan to establish a nation and a plan to make us right with him to address this sin problem. But they are really in the age that you and I would consider kind of a retirement age. And you have to think about, I don't know what stage of life you're in right now. Maybe you're younger, maybe you're getting towards kind of what you call a retirement age. I got to let you know, either as a warning or an encouragement, God will use you all throughout your life. You may come to a spot when you're in your 60s or more, and God gives you a new adventure. God does not limit his plans for you based on how far along you are in the path that you have expected. And that's what we see here. So as they go on this, obediently, they do find trouble on the road, and they've been traveling for about 1,000 years now. 1,000 years, 1,000 miles. That's a lot. I bet it feels like that, you know? So we continue in Genesis 12, verse 10. And now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. And as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. And if you read on, that's what happens. Pharaoh finds Sarai, adds her to his house, and God punishes Pharaoh, just as we saw in the promise, that he will curse those that curse Abram. And so you see this poor decision. You know, this is not God's example of how you should treat your wife. It is amusing to me that I don't think that marriage dynamics have changed a great deal in a couple thousand years because, you know, he says, just before they get there, Sarah, I know you are very beautiful. And, you know, she's like, I'm not going to like your next sentence. What do you want? Abram makes this poor decision out of fear. And Sarai is obedient. But it's really God that shows up, even though this decision takes place out of fear. So what I want to remember is that as Sarah goes through these challenges, that these were people who had lives and were making decisions, okay? These are decisions made in the moment. And it makes me think about how you tend to look back on things in the past. This last April, I had the opportunity to go to a groundbreaking ceremony at Williamson Trade School in Pennsylvania, which is a trade school that my family has had a lot of hand in. We've had at least 4 generations of men go through there. My grandfather was the president for a short while. That's just the way that worked out. And it was neat to see, for the groundbreaking for the Watson dormitory, for my uncle Wayne Watson, just to see this picture of how an interaction with a family had a final impact over in an institution that's been there for over 100 years. But it made me think of, maybe you've done this, and young people definitely have this question. Talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents, and say, you know, when did Pop-Up move from here to here? When did he decide to do that? Because we tend to think in terms of, well, my grandparents, this was the arc of their life, and this is how it went, and that was how it was planned out. But you forget that there was struggle here, and they moved because of this challenge there. And so it's helpful when we read the Bible, when we see flawed people just like us that sometimes make good decisions and sometimes make poor decisions, that they are living their lives and facing decisions sometimes out of fear, and so we need to learn from that. But as we look at what happened, we realize that God's call does not guarantee comfort, okay? Abram and Sarai did as they were told, but then the famine showed up. There's no indication that the famine was because they did something wrong. They went in obedience, and there were still difficult times. So we need to not be surprised at the fact that if we follow the Lord, not everything is going to be smooth or as we expect. And it's also worth noting that this is not an example to follow. You know, if people talk about the Bible that aren't too experienced, they'll say, you know, well, look at all these bad examples. We say, well, You're not asked to follow the bad examples. You're shown examples of how flawed people interacted with God, and you learn from their mistakes and the grace that God provided to them. So it's a bad move on Abram's part, but it shows us the challenges that they went through. And Sarah remains faithful to Abram and to God and continues on this journey. And God does wind up punishing Pharaoh. So we move on to chapter 2, waiting and consequences. And some time passes before God says this to Abram. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. So even Abraham is feeling the pressure of this situation. He's got this promise from God, and he tells God, he says, you haven't given me an heir. I can't even transfer my property to my own family. And we all hate waiting, I know that. But this is more than just sort of an impatience waiting, I think. This is sort of a, will the promise that you've put before me come true? Because I can't see any way that you're going to do it. And it brings up whatever it is that you're waiting for. Does how you're waiting bring you closer to God or further apart? Do you find yourself in a position where you get more and more bitter because you're not getting what you perceived God promised you? That maybe you think he's abandoned you? Does it kind of spoil you away from him? Or does it remind you to lean on him because you know that he's the one that has a plan in place? And for me, I kind of need some help to catch when I'm doing that. So for me, it's always that phrase, I'd be happy if. I'll only be able to then. Okay, so maybe it's like, well, once we've paid off this debt, then we can start tithing, or maybe when the kids get out of college, then we can finally do the things we like. Or maybe when work isn't so busy, then I can spend time with my family. So what you find is whatever that thing is that you've linked to the most important thing in your life, you imagine that now is a problem, but once it's done, you can then start being faithful. So what is God turning you into as you wait? Is God turning you into a patient person who he can use to encourage others, or are you ignoring that influence? So what are you longing for? Maybe just like Sarah, you're waiting for a family. That's my niece Gabrielle. Cheeks for days, right? Really, she's up there because I'm a totally smitten uncle. That's my brother in the background. That's actually how we like it, with him kind of faded out in the back, out of focus from her. I love my brother dearly. It has been so neat to interact with them, and so it's been such a pleasure to interact with them. So maybe for you it's a direct thing. And by the way, if that's where you are right now, if it's a family or kids or relationship, can I just say, God loves you. We joke around here, but that is a difficult thing to go through. And you will probably have a lot of well-meaning friends say some things, and some things will probably come across as encouraging and helpful. And some of those may be hurtful because you feel like they don't know what they're talking about. But I just want to encourage you that God's timing is good. But it's not just that. Imagine it could be anything. It could be career. Maybe you've been waiting to kind of feel like you make a difference, or maybe you want that respect, or maybe you've been praying your whole life for family or friends to come to Christ, and you're just sort of saying, God, why haven't you done this? This is a good thing. And I want you to get the picture of that's where Sarah is. She's linked herself to this promise that God has given, and she doesn't see any way for him to solve it. And that's when we get into Sarah's plan. And she hatches this ill-conceived plot, and ill-conceived. She hatches this terrible plan that we see in Genesis 16:1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarah said, So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai his wife took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do whatever you think's best." Then Sarah mistreated Hagar, and so she fled from her. Again, with the conflict, I know that doesn't happen here in any marriages where someone has an idea and then someone else takes the credit. "Oh, it wasn't my idea, it was your idea." I know that doesn't happen. The bottom line here is, what a mess. You know, if you were reading this and you just say, "Sarah, no, why would you do that?" Even in this mess, this probably family fracture, the struggle, all of this, there's still a measure of faith that Sarah shows in that she believed God's promise that Abram would have a son and a legacy, but she just doesn't see a way that she's involved with it. So she does it the wrong way. And I have to pause the tape here a second to say, can you imagine how Sarai's feeling? She comes up with this terrible plan, this sinful adultery idea, and God is not encouraging this kind of marriage fracture situation. So she comes up with this plot, and her servant is pregnant by Abram. And then there's this conflict, and she mistreats Hagar, and Hagar runs away pregnant into the desert. And you have to imagine that Sarai is thinking, what did I do? The first plan didn't seem to work, but this one with Hagar, even though it's a mess, at least she's pregnant, but now she's run because of how I treated her. Is she going to die in the wilderness? Have I ruined everything? I don't know if you've ever had a moment like that where you're sort of wondering, what did I do? I worked for a summer job as a database admin at Raytheon, and summer hire, young, working on a database. And the way you update a database, if you're young, is you make a backup, you save all that, and then you make your changes, and then you delete the original and you replace it. So I went to do that one day, and when I went to delete the live one with all the real data in it, it wouldn't delete. And I thought, well, that's funny. The only reason it wouldn't delete is if someone was using it. Oh, I deleted all the live data that someone had entered. So there is no way around that. You know, sometimes you have a problem where you say, it was a tech problem. This was a call my boss, call their boss. Here's what we have to do. I erased all of your data. And that's a silly little picture of just sort of like, I cannot move forward without help from higher above, in this case, my boss. And it involves some reconciliation and some apologies and so on. So we find that in this mess, we have to do God's work God's way. So I've been really encouraged at the chapel to watch the elders and the staff wrestle with the challenges of, as we grow, how do we expand in a way that follows God's will and doesn't just focus on the bottom line of more people, more funds, whatever it is. It is so tempting, as Sarah did here, when she says, perhaps I can, foster a family through this. We've had a lot of churches that have kind of thought, like on a mission like this, we have something really important, and it's God's will, but what we're doing is we're focusing on the bottom line and not focusing on the character of the fruits of the Spirit. So it is so easy when we have a large mission to not focus on doing things God's way. And I'm thankful to have seen with humility the focus here on God's way and not just what he wants in the end. And we will find out that God's unfailing love shows up with what happens next. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord came to her, said to her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." So what is the result of all this? You cannot ruin God's plans. Even though we have this poor decision where Sarai took things into her own hands, and there's all this suffering that happens, God blesses not only those involved, but even those kind of down the line. So Hagar, who seemed like a victim in this situation, she is shown this kindness and mercy from God. So you see that sometimes you have consequences, not just to yourself, but to others, but God is gracious all over the place. And let me just say that if you have faced in your life some of those difficult things that also happen to be very visible, marriage challenges, abortion, divorce, any of these things that tend to be visible that everyone sees, it is so easy for us to judge because we see that. And what we see here is that God judges Sarah as faithful and doesn't map her as the one who made this big mistake. He continues to use her. So I hope that you can be encouraged if you're seeing yourself in light of a mistake, that God has a plan for you. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So we come to the final third chapter, the fulfillment. And we'll skip forward a bit. And God shows up with this covenant for Abram a third time. He says, "No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." God also said to Abraham, "As for Sarah your wife, you are no longer call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." Then God said, "Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you this time next year." So this is God's covenant, and what we skipped over is the fact that God has given Abraham the covenant of circumcision, a reminder of the covenant. And as I was setting this up in sort of the chapters that show Sarah's life, without having meant to, I realized that God shows up to give a promise as the introduction to each of the 3 chapters. And it's just, wait a minute. So God has a plan and shows up for all the chapters of your life. And it just stunned me that he was consistent there. I knew he was consistent, but I hadn't seen it so blindingly obvious. And so he gives the news of what will happen and the names, and he changes them. And when we have to talk about names and identities, I want to encourage you that you may be living with kind of a false name. I don't know if maybe you're, like we said about defining yourself in terms of some mistake you've made or something you didn't do or some regret. So maybe you're calling yourself some name like weak or promise breaker or something, when God wants to call you a name like beloved, strong in me, forgiven. So remember that God can change your life and your identity at any point throughout the battle. And we see that Isaac's name means he laughs, which we'll get to in a minute. So we've seen these revelations that God shows to Abraham, but he then sends some visitors directly so that Sarah can get this affirmation just for herself. So he sends these 3 visitors, that's really the Lord and 2 angels, talking to Abram, saying, "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent." Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, Will I really have a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." You're picturing the same thing I have. This any family situation where your kids are listening and it's like, "I didn't say that." Yeah, you did. You definitely did. But you notice that she didn't say it out loud. It says that she laughed within herself, okay? So don't think, as the way I sometimes do, that you can get credit for being more spiritual by just keeping your critical thought on the inside. We serve a God who sees our hearts and knows what we're thinking. And we don't have to discuss it's not really clear if Sarah is laughing because she doesn't believe it or because she's just struck by this or if it's in disbelief or joy. But she reacts at this. And I don't know if you've ever had to walk something back. I had a job where I had to work for someone who then became program manager, program director. So I had some tidy up work for them. And so we're sitting at a level much higher than I'm comfortable with around a big table. And as they're talking, I found a Post-it note that was on my notes that just struck me as funny. And as soon as they said something, I saw this, and without realizing it, they spoke, and I said, "Ha! Oi. Something's funny that I said?" No, that's a note, and just, never mind. Aren't you glad we serve a gracious God? So you've got this timeline in mind. And it's probably different from God's. And you need to be aware that God has a plan, and it won't always match what you're thinking of, but God is gracious. So if we jump to the next time that God talks to us, he says, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave him the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him." Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she said, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son at this old age." So really what we find out is that God gets the last laugh. He had planned Isaac's name to be "He Laughs." But when we say that God gets the last laugh, we have to make clear that you don't think we mean that God is malicious or that he's a trickster or that he's playing with us. The fact that Sarah says this, that she has joy and laughter, means that she has seen that God's plan for her son, despite it was so surprising that she laughed inwardly to herself, that now with her son that she's waited so long for, reminds her of God's joy and happiness, and she can rejoice in that instead of painting it in the picture of bitterness and waiting. And Sarah is filled with these joyful reminders. And you think about the time that it took for her to have this promised son. And I've heard that moms need a lot of patience. I think that that's pretty true. I have to believe that Sarah was a great mother for whenever dealing with her son and the future, that she could think in terms of, this is the promised one that God delivered, after so much time. So as we transition to communion, we think about all the time that Sarah spent waiting. But you say, who spent more time waiting? God was with her the whole time. We mentioned Eve last week and the problem of sin, and God has been waiting from then to now to set up his plan of salvation. And we see that this calling Abraham and Sarah out, is part of that plan to bring us to him so that we would have the nation of Israel and all the examples to understand that when he sent his son, Jesus Christ, to die for us, we could be with him forever. In that third covenant that we talked about from Abraham, he says, "My covenant in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant." We serve a God who is endlessly faithful. We are flawed people who serve a perfect and faithful God, and we need reminders. And God shows us these reminders all over the place. So as we prepare to celebrate that and be reminded of his sacrifice for us in the bread and communion, remember that he shed his blood and died so that we could remember his sacrifice and his plan from the beginning to now to be with him.